Welcome to the 10th episode of the Right Cast. This is it. We are at the 10th point. There's a lot of things that reach 10. Fast and Furious 10, Final Fantasy 10. Great things. Of course, as we're on the 10th episode, we're going to discuss something that we have kind of brought up here and there in the past. It's something that I personally have voiced my opinion on a number of times. People who know me, this is definitely one of those things that I get a little bit sometimes fired up about. I'm sure I won't get too fired up this episode because, I've had time to work it out and to get used to it. But at the same time, it is something I think is worth asking. And this is one of those topics that I think helps to set this podcast apart sometimes, in the sense that we'll address things that I don't think you're always going to see people address. So, like the episode we did on modesty and diversity and those kinds of things, or for real intent, this is one of those episodes where we're going to kind of ask a question that I don't think a lot of people ask, but should ask, which is, should you really be giving writing advice if you yourself are not actually much of a writer? Now, just to clarify what I mean by that, let's say you get on social media. That could be YouTube, it could be TikTok, it could be Twitter. Please don't go on Twitter. But whatever one it is, right? You're on there and you basically are giving out writing advice, saying, you shouldn't start your book with a prologue. And you're saying it as an authority, like this is what you should or shouldn't do. Okay, there's no harm in that, right? Now the assumption is that if you're doing that, then surely it's based or rooted in some form of experience. There's something that you've done that gives you a certain degree of confidence to say this. But we're specifically talking about people where they say things like this, and then you look to see, oh, what is this based on? Who they have some writing, something I could see. Because look, me and Anthony, we've both written a novel and we've both published something and it's out there, which firstly, again, as I pointed out in earlier episodes, means that right now, if you was to go look in the description and you thought, oh, what are these guys talking about? They haven't written anything. Well, you can go and see what we've written. And then you can judge for yourself whether or not you like it and blah, blah, blah. But it's not so much necessarily the quality of the work in and of itself, because that's to a degree going to always be subjective. It's more just about the fact that there are people who build up followings or who have services, courses, like literally people who ask people to pay for things, and there's no real evident experience or anything to kind of justify why they're giving that advice. And I'm just going to be honest, what can oftentimes happen with people who do that is if they don't have a book, they don't have something they've made, when they eventually do, it is not uncommon for it to turn out that they do not follow their own advice, that they do not practice what they preach, that a lot of the concepts and ideas that they have been putting out over the years that got them to a certain level of status, they for some reason don't seem to be using it, which is very interesting because that advice is what is given them the platform and the audience. So it's very bizarre. But anyway, I'm sure as I'm saying this, there are some of you out there who may think, I guess I have seen that. Maybe you thought about it before, maybe you didn't. And since this episode and many of our episodes and the podcast in general typically is addressing people who are storytellers either now or who would like to go on to create stories in the future, I think this is something worth thinking about, because let's say, for example, you're thinking about making a channel or a podcast. What are we really saying here? I think it's something to kind of discuss. So, Anthony, what are your thoughts on this topic? What do you have to say on it?
I have so many different thoughts. It's hard to pick a certain direction to go through.
Mhm.
I think it is kind of interesting where the first thing that popped into your mind while we were discussing this is the fact that writing, even just storytelling, is that nebulous field where if you go to any other area of expertise, the first thing you look for is experience. Like, if I want medical advice, I want to see a doctor with experience who has a license to practice medicine. If I'm having car trouble, I'm going to see a mechanic who, yeah, there may not be as many certifications for a mechanic as there is for a doctor, but generally speaking, If something's wrong with my car, I want someone who has experience working on cars. Storytelling is that weird area where a lot of people go and they seek advice or they want the opinion of people who, as you said, might have never worked on their own book, might have never made their own comic, might have never done anything storytelling related, and yet they are popular for their opinion. Now, I think that's kind of area that separates them all, where there are objective things about medicine that you have to pay attention to that'll make someone healthy or not. There are objective rules you need to follow in order to make a car and make it run well. There are very few, if any, objective rules when it comes to storytelling. There are certainly practices and principles that you want to follow in order to make your story better most of the time. But for every rule out there, I can usually think of an exception. I've even got into arguments with people. The funny thing is, many of them who have never written a book, where they give this is a rule of storytelling, and then I immediately turn around and say, this is a novel that completely violates that rule, that you should read and understand why that rule doesn't work.
Yeah. That's a very good point as well, because that is very, very true. There's too many times I've been in like some kind of writing group or something, and I have to point this out. Obviously, everyone is at different stages in their writing journey, and I don't expect everyone, especially because writing can take time. I don't expect everyone to just be like, well, I can't ever talk about writing ever a day in my life until I've published a book. That's kind of absurd. I don't think that's fair. And let's be honest, all of us have had opinions about storytelling, whether we had 100 words down or 100,000 words. But what my thing is that there's a difference between kind of offering your opinion and then offering advice as though you're some kind of qualified expert. And what's very interesting about it to me, more so than anything, is the fact that it can work. That's actually the thing that I've always found fascinating with it. Because when I first started ever considering giving writing advice, like as content on YouTube, I was still a teenager, about 18 or so. And I remember my biggest apprehension about even doing that was, well, who am I to tell anyone? First of all, I'm fairly young. I'm younger than a lot of other people. So I don't even feel like I'm really in a position where I have enough years of writing experience to really sit there and tell you what you should do. Now, bear in mind, I did know that my understanding of writing storytelling was very good. And I did know that I could come up with my own concepts. Because that's another thing as well that I will bring up is that, a lot of regurgitated material as opposed to people kind of coming up with their own original stuff as well. That's another part of it. But even though like I knew I could convey that information, there was something in me that kind of, I had the same logic as what you said. Like, well, in any other field, if you was gonna say something, you'd have to be qualified. Like, if you wanted to get in shape, I would assume you're going to go and get a personal trainer who's in shape. I would assume that's what you're gonna do. But again, like for some reason with this field, it's not like that. Which is something I'll ask you about in a minute. But yeah, like I just always found it very interesting because I would watch just different content on YouTube. And my very first instinct, like when I would listen to podcasts from authors like Brandon Sanderson with Mary Robinette Cole, Dan Wells, I would immediately, every time they had a guest on, I would go and look in those show notes or I would just Google their name just to see what they wrote. And it's not to be like, oh, are you good or not? Not necessarily. It's more just curiosity, interest, and also because they're sitting there telling me what I should or shouldn't do. I want to see what have they done because I just want to be able to compare it to what I'm doing. I'm trying to learn and get better. So it helps, especially if I do like your advice, especially if I do respect what you're saying. Imagine if Brandon Sanderson did all those writing lectures and there was no Brandon Sanderson books to look at. Like the big reason why I started reading his books and why I got into reading Mistborn, which massively helped me to get into fantasy as a whole, is because when I watched those writing lectures and he would reference his books, which again, you can't do that if you've not, you can't reference your own experience of writing something if you've not done it. So you always have to rely on using other people's works as examples, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But again, I think it's very interesting just seeing that kind of difference between people where you've got experience, you've done it, and then you've got people who don't have experience and haven't done it, but they're offering the experience as though they're offering the advice as though they have. Um, and again, like I say, what part of the issue with that is that then when they do create something, people are shocked. Like, I thought they would have this amazing thing because they said, and it's like, I'm not that shocked because they didn't have any proof of this. So why would you think that they could, a lot of people can talk a good game, but, and they can't necessarily walk the walk, right? And I think that's a very interesting point in of itself, because I sometimes wonder how that happens still, because I still feel like if you sit there and you do say something to the effect of, you know, in order to have strong character conflict, your character needs to have a motivation. Da, da, da. That sounds like basic storytelling advice that anyone could say, which it kind of is. So why is it that sometimes these people do not put that in the stories? That's like, I'm just going to be honest. To me, that's crazy. I actually don't get it, at all, because it's not even that. It's not even that insane of a thing to do, right? So I find that very interesting. But the question I wanted to kind of ask you anyway, Anthony, was why do you think it is that the people, because when I, like I said, when I was starting, or I would think about doing this, I didn't feel comfortable doing it. So what I did do instead was I said, all I'm going to be able to tell people is what I've learned as I'm in the process of doing it, because I still wanted to talk about it, but I didn't feel like I had the ability or the authority to tell you what you should do. So it was more like, okay, I'm just going to share what I have seen that I like and what I'm trying to implement in my own writing and what seems to be helping. For example, I remember I did a video ages ago about how I overcame writer's block. That's my own personal experience. It's not necessarily going to work for you, but since it's something that did work for me, it's something I can share. That's actually based on my actual experience. I'm not telling you to do something that I've never gone through in my life. You get what I mean? So I think there are ways you can still engage in doing that without necessarily having to rely upon purely second or third hand experience, if that makes sense. So what would you say is the reason, though, why some people don't seem to have that or don't care? Do you think is that they don't care, or do you think they just don't think about it? Like that they feel, basically why they feel comfortable just leaping straight in and being like, I'm just going to give all this storytelling advice, even though I've never written a thing a day in my life. Because personally, for me, I just, like, even as a teenager, where you would think I would have this youthful arrogance, I still felt like, oh, I don't think I should do that. So do you think I was wrong for that? Or, I mean, I guess not, but, do you think that, what do you think is the reason why people don't have that? Or not people, but the people that don't?
So to kind of tie into what you said earlier, if you've never written something, you're not everything you're going to say is going to be spot on perfect, but you can still say a lot of good things. And it just goes back into the overall discussion of just how easy it is to do it, how easy it is to learn how to understand what makes for good storytelling compared to other fields of research. Something I think about often is that me and my dad have surprisingly similar tastes and ability to measure what makes a good story or not. Like, it is very rare. Like, out of the last 100 movies that we've seen, I would say we've given the same score 99 out of the 100 times. And I'm this English grad. I've read hundreds upon hundreds of more books than he has. I've watched a bunch of TV shows. Like, he's never played a video game in his life outside of Joust. I don't think he's ever seen more than like 5 minutes of an anime episode besides just looking over his shoulder and seeing what I'm watching on TV. But when it comes to movies and the occasional book that he does pick up, he can read it, he can engage with it, and he can say exactly what works and what doesn't work, despite me having so much more experience and understanding than he does. And I think that's true for a lot of people, where even though they don't have the same experience, they don't have the same interests, they don't even have that skill to be able to write, they can still tell you the fundamentals of what makes good storytelling or not from what they've sampled and engaged with in their life.
So Do you think then that alone is what gives them the confidence to say, I'm going to start a YouTube channel or a TikTok or et cetera, and I'm going to now tell people what they should do to make a good story? Even though if people turn around and ask me, hey, where's your story? I'm going to have nothing to show them.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that if I were to take my dad and replace me with him as a podcast host for a couple of these episodes, I would argue he would probably do just as good of a job, if not a
Mm-hmm.
better job, depending on the subject.
Mm-hmm.
If the subject was like what makes a good hero or what makes a good ending, I think he could do an incredible job. But if you were to turn around and make it like, what are good writing habits? How long should a book be? More of the mechanical stuff, then yeah, he would just be like a fish out of water. He would have no idea what to say. And I think that's kind of what the issue is and the weaknesses of some of these channels of people who have never engaged in proper storytelling of their own is that they can tell you a lot about what makes a good story, but they can't tell you anything about the mechanics of how to develop a good story.
Do you think a lot of that though comes down to the fact that if we're just being honest, a lot of that information has been around long before those people saying it? So I mean, realistically, you can just listen to people who already did do that and learned it from experience, and then you're just regurgitating their experience. I could tell you a lot of things about countries I've never been to a day in my life because I've just soaked in what other people have told me about those places. Like even what you were telling me in one of our previous episodes about when you went to, it was Venezuela, right? Like I could take that.
Argentina.
Yeah, sorry, Argentina. I could take that and I could just be like, yeah, that's, and I could just start using like expanding that as part of my, like, which, don't get me wrong, secondhand experience is a thing, but it's not presented like that. It's presented as, this is what you should do, and I am the authority figure telling you what you should do, and you should listen to me because what? That's more what it is for me. It's not the fact that someone gives advice, because like I said earlier, you could be in writing groups where no one's ever finished a project and everyone's going to share feedback about what they thought was good or bad about someone's writing. And I don't think it would be sensible to just turn around and be like, you know what, you've never actually finished something, so you don't get to give me like, I'm not saying I don't think that would really work. But what I'm more trying to say is I'm really more thinking about the authority figure type of thing. I just find it very interesting, because it makes me wonder sometimes, that apprehension I had, it often makes me think maybe I just shouldn't have worried about that, because clearly it doesn't matter. And that's another thing I wanted to ask, because it's really, these people, you cannot be an authority figure without the fact that people are giving you the authority. There has to be an audience that views you that way. And what's very interesting is that a lot of people in the audience may have way more experience, like what you're saying about yourself compared to your dad, for example, but they will still follow the lead of someone who has no, like, work. And I find that very interesting. So what do you think is the reason why people will do that? Because like we've already said, comparing that to other fields, I am really struggling to see someone go into, like you said, a mechanic, a plumber, an electrician, and it's like, hey, have you ever worked on these things? No. Okay, sure. Sure, go ahead, mess with my electrics. Like, yeah, like nobody's gonna do that. You know what I mean? So
Mhm.
I find it very interesting. Like, where does that, like, where's the switch? Why does it flip for people? Do you think?
I think it maybe goes back to what you said, where because it is regurgitation and it's just a lot of repeating what others are saying, it probably boils down to that for the average person who's looking for that kind of help and looking for those kind of answers, they probably already have most of them inside their head already. They're just looking for someone to word it in such a way that it will cause that light bulb to go off. They'll cause that switch to turn so that they can figure out what they need to fix whatever it is they're working on. But I suppose an interesting question I would ask you to kind of turn around is, what do you think the metrics are for some of these people where I go to someone looking for storytelling advice or writing advice, and it's a channel that is run by someone who has never written anything? What percentage of the audience do you think is actively working on a project? And what percentage of the audience is just like, I'm bored, I want something entertaining while informative to listen to? Like, even with our own channel, what percentage of our audience do you think is actively writing right now? And what percentage is just like, I'm trying to kill some time here?
That's hard to gauge. Um, I would say though, just based on what I understand about the experience I've had being in writing groups and writing like servers and stuff like that, writing forums, I would say the vast majority of the time people are not working on something, or they were and it's been like spread out over years and they kind of work on it here and there and they kind of don't. And it's like the vast majority of people are not actively like working on banging out like 2K words a day or something. That is not happening. The vast majority of people, they maybe had this story idea they never really fleshed out, or there was something they started writing 5 years ago. They kind of set it aside, and fair enough, things happen, but then they're kind of like, dipping their toe in. And I actually think that is probably what makes up the bulk of most people's audiences in most fields. If I would guarantee the vast majority of people who watch travel content, the vast majority of people who watch fitness content, investing content, I guarantee the vast majority of the people who watch these things, it's more of a kind of it's more of people kind of living vicariously through the creator rather than actually participating in it themselves. And it's more of a kind of thing where they'll do this kind of idle, imagining of what they would do if they was to make their story. And and I guess that's maybe why it doesn't matter as much. I guess like maybe that's actually probably what it is, because I think when I was sitting down and I was watching things, I'm very specific, like passionate and very very much focused on, I will be writing a story. I need to have story advice. I need to learn. I need to craft so I can become way better. It was very serious for me. So I guess that would explain maybe why for me I would pay much closer attention. I know one thing for a fact is that the vast majority of people did not do even what I was doing, where it's like when I listen to a podcast, oh, who is that? Who's this guest? I'm gonna go look up every single, but even if it was topics I didn't really care about, I'd still do it. I'd sometimes even listen to episodes. I'm just like, I gotta hear this because I just gotta know. I'd watch author interviews. The video's got 100 views. It's in 240p. No one wants to watch this, but I will watch it because I just got to know and get all. Like it was like I was obsessed, and so I do have to. I do bear that in mind that I could be looking at it differently. But again, like we keep saying, am I really though? Because when it comes to other things, it's not like that. But I think that with storytelling and art and writing in general, I think this leads into something else that's a bit of a broader thing to do with just the role of a writer or a storyteller and arts, and the fact that because it can be this very, I often think of it like airy fairy type of thing, or very, head in the clouds, woo, just let the art flow, like the muse. Because there's that romanticism, I think that plays into it as well. There's in creative endeavors, I think because it's creative, there's always going to be a mentality of not being restrictive. So even when it comes down to the people who are giving you the information, it's kind of like, look, anyone can give good advice. Which this is the funny thing about it. I actually do agree with that, and I don't think that just because something's not written something, they cannot present information or anything like that. But I think that it's the, again, I'm just going to keep saying it, it's the authority figure thing specifically. It's the fact that someone, all right, I'll just say it like this. I find it very absurd if someone's going to sell you a course on writing before they've written so if I do go and look for a product, I'm seeing a writing course before I'm seeing actual writing from them. I mean, I'm sorry, but someone tell me, someone tell me that's like the cart before the horse. Someone tell me in what universe that makes sense. Because I don't know what universe that makes sense. I don't think even Doctor Strange can find a universe where that makes sense. It just doesn't. It's not gonna happen because I just don't. It's funny because I definitely understand. I don't think that you should, like, no one can give advice. It's just I'm sure people can somewhat understand why I'm getting where I'm going with this, right? Um, but yeah, it's a very interesting thing. So I think I answered the question you was asking, but yeah. Um, oh, sorry, was you gonna say something?
Oh no, I think you.
Okay, all right, yeah. So the other thing as well that I was gonna say was to do with what I just brought up, the romanticism. Do you think that I'm correct and that does play into it, or not really?
I think it definitely plays a role into it, but it just goes back to the overall discussion where with so many other fields, there is a certain objectivity to it. There is a certain, you have to do it this way, or else you're going to get some very bad results. Whereas because of that romanticism, because writing is definitely more of a emotional field mixed in with the logical, you kind of go your own way and see what you produce. That
But that's the
does. Oh,
no, I was gonna say, but that's the funny thing though, because again, it's the presentation of it. See, I think if it was more presented in a subjective manner, I would understand. But it's not. A lot of times, even the actual videos or the TikTok, the entire energy of it is this is what you should do, and this is what you shouldn't do. And it's very much objective. Like, this is what you should do. If you do not follow these top 5 tips, your writing will be garbage. Like, that is the energy. Even if they don't say those specific words, if I'm watching it as a casual viewer, it comes across like I better do that or else. And so that's more why it's like they do speak as though they're the authority. You must do these things. And it's like, based on what? And this goes back to what you said about a lot of the time the disagreements you'll have with people. You're someone who's written things and is more widely read, so you've seen a lot more examples of the rules being broken or bent than they maybe have, and so they're saying, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, again, probably because they're regurgitating things and they've not actually thought for themselves about, hey, can you do it differently? And they've not tried. So because of that, they're just repackaging and reposting old ideas, which I'm just going to be honest, that's a common theme today in the social media age. It's a normal thing to do. Even, I mean, the things we're getting up here saying isn't going to be entirely original, but I don't think you could. At the end of the day, we're always going to be able to reference and give our own experience on things we have specifically done, and that gives a certain level of authenticity to it. That, as far as I'm concerned, gives you a great level of authority. When I was first originally starting and I hadn't written my first book and I had no book, I didn't have anything like that. Yes, I could understand certain things that I still agree with today. Yes, there's certain things I would have said back then that I would still say right now. But at the end of the day, I feel a lot more like justified in saying it to you now, or saying it in a more authoritative way than I would have back then. So I do think it matters, and I don't know, maybe it's just something, that just bothers me, and it's not that big of a deal to most people. I'm really not sure, which is part of the reason I think it's cool for us to talk about this, because it's not something people really talk about. So it's one of those things where I sit there and I think, am I just crazy? Because it doesn't seem like anyone cares. And yeah, I don't know, I'm not sure. And that's actually a very common thing, I think, right now in the social media era, is you have a lot of people who are experts on things they've never done. And I think that's really something social media has facilitated, because anyone can get online and just talk. And because anyone can talk, and we have to be honest, there are some people who are very good orators. There's some people who are very, very good at presenting things, who have amazing content creation skills. But that does not translate necessarily to, oh, I'm going to be a great storyteller, or well, they might be a great storyteller in terms of their videos. But when it comes down to making a book or writing for television or something, like the things that they're trying to instruct you on, they don't necessarily have the ability to do that. So what do you think then about when it turns out that they don't have that ability? Like, so, okay, yeah, they've come out and they're saying all this stuff, and then it's like, oh, well, actually, it's not that great. Do you think people would be justified in feeling bad about that, or feeling like, oh, I thought this person would be better because they were saying XYZ in their videos, but they're not? Like, do you think it's justified for people to feel bad about that, or do you think that it doesn't really matter?
so I think it's justified if you yourself have never written anything. As someone who has written many books, when I read the first attempt by someone who considers himself an expert in storytelling and realize that it's bad, that doesn't surprise me, because, yeah, I have that experience to know, of course, it's not going to be good. It's very, very rare for someone to make something excellent on their first try.
Yeah.
But I don't even think that, even if someone considers themselves an expert or a popular authority on storytelling and produces something very bad, either as their first attempt or their 10th attempt, that's just part of storytelling in general, where there are pretty much every writer on the planet, even if they have decades of experience, is going to eventually write something that they are not happy with. Now, depending on the industry, that's never going to see the light of day.
Yeah.
Uh, like there was a funny article I was reading on IGN the other day where they were having to defend the fact that the average video game score for them is a 7 instead of a 5. I actually understand where they were coming from because when you have that much money involved, it's very rare for a game to get greenlit that's going to be anything less than a 7. Like
Right.
generally by that point, if it's getting released, it's because they knew ahead of time this is going to work for most people.
Yes. Yeah.
I definitely see a lot more 4 or 5s or lower when it's a movie, and I definitely see a lot of 2s and 3s when it's a book
Yeah.
because of the level of investment and time it takes to produce something. And so to me, that's part of the learning process. That's part of the storytelling process. There's people who are just like, I know it's bad, but I want to get it out there because I want that experience or because I still feel like there's something in there that's good enough that maybe someone will love.
Mhm.
But I would even say for people who are watching this, just because we talk a lot about storytelling, you might read our books and be like, that isn't as good as I thought it would be, despite how much the fact we are talking about storytelling all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the thing is that, like I said earlier, because it's subjective medium, that's just going to be the case anyway. But at least there is something to look at. That's really what more my thing is. It's like, at least there is something to look at. We're not just sitting up here like, this is what storytelling is, and this is what it isn't. And you should do X, Y, Z, and da, 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 da. And to be honest, I don't think we're even really that much. We don't, I think we understand the subjective nature of a lot of these things. So we're not really too much on the hard and fast rules, especially because I think of our style of storytelling and our taste. We're the type of people we like the idea of the subversion and deconstruction. So I don't think either of us are suited to that. Whereas I think a lot of other writers I've come across, they're a lot more kind of, stringent. Is that the right word? That word was in my head. Can't remember what that word means. Stringent, I think, is a good word. They're a lot more, reserved about what they'll kind of be open to. I mean, there's even people who've been like, "Oh, I don't think you should borrow from other mediums." I mean, that's what some people say. Like, don't if you're writing a book, you should only look at books. And I'm like, okay, so I should never look at a movie, or obviously you got to understand the differences in mediums. They're correct about that part, but you can still borrow things because it's still stories. So it's interesting because again, someone who would say something like that, a lot of times they've not written or finished something, but they have a lot of energy to tell you what you should or shouldn't do, as though they have. And I find that just for me personally, when I would look at that stuff, firstly, I would more judge it just based on whether or not I thought the advice made sense and whether it kind of aligned with like authors that I already knew of and that I looked up to and respected. But also I would just on some level think, but how do you know that? What is that based on? Because even if you was to go and look at other people who are actually published and who are veterans in the field, a lot of them wouldn't say that. So again, it's very interesting, I guess, where some ideas uh people have come from, especially when they seem to have less experience. But yeah, I mean, is there any final comments or kind of points you want to make on this topic, or anything that you feel like we should say before we sign off? You know?
Yeah, so it's funny where I think of the two of us, it definitely bothers me less than it does you when someone gives writing advice or storytelling advice that's never written anything. But I'll also be the first person to say, hey, there's nothing stopping you from taking the time to try to write something. Even if you never publish it, even if you don't go more than a few chapters, I do think everyone should at least make the attempt,
Mhm.
partially because there's going to be people who are like, wow, I have a knack for this. I'm enjoying this. I really want to finish the story. And there's also going to be people who realize, oh, I now understand why I'm giving this advice. Or they may come to realize I should be giving different advice because me having to do this in practice is definitely going to make you see things differently than just discussing it from an outsider's point of view.
Yeah, you'd be surprised how many things you think you know until you start putting pen to paper or key to keyboard, Microsoft Word page, right? Something you'll be surprised because you realize there's so many times. Even you could write an entire outline, you could have entire documents about character arcs fleshed out, and then you get to write, and you're like, actually no, right? Especially if you do have that. storyteller instinct will kick in, and it might adjust you. You're like, no, that actually doesn't work. That doesn't make any sense, And that's something you learn through experience. And now you have that experience as something valuable and of substance from your own life to share with people when you're giving them advice. And you can say, hey, this is how I learned this. This is something I went through. I just think it just makes people's advice more genuine. I just think if I was learning from someone, I would prefer. And that's another thing for me, is that there's all the advice out there. And I will say this in fairness. I think a big part of it, especially years ago when I was first looking at it, a big issue was that a lot of the you could say the veterans or the authors, because a lot of them would be a bit more like introverted or reclusive or whatever. A lot of them didn't really like make YouTube content. They might have blogs, they might do a podcast, but they wouldn't necessarily be on YouTube as a YouTuber. It's only more recently where even someone like Brandon Sanderson, he's still one of the only ones really. That's actually out here like that will make content. And even he wasn't doing that back at the time when I was looking for that stuff. He had his lectures on YouTube, but his actual channel, he wasn't making anything. So it's kind of interesting because that right there has given, like, when people go and look for the information, they're going to want to see the packaging, the content in this fun way, in a vibrant way, in a way where they can, it just feels entertaining to watch. So a lot of those people, if they can package it and make it entertaining, I guess like fair enough, because at the end of the day, the information is still getting across, and I guess people are still going to learn one way or another. So it's not necessarily the end of the world. I think it's just, all I would say to people is, don't necessarily expect them to come out with this great thing, or to make these amazing masterpieces immediately just because they're telling you, or they had a video about how to make a masterpiece. I'm not saying they did make that video, but let's just say in theory they did. Or what makes something a masterpiece. It's just something to bear in mind. A lot of people can talk the talk but not walk the walk. I think there's even a saying about those who can't do teach, which I don't entirely always agree with that saying. I really don't. But like, because I feel like, well, if they can't do it at all, then But again, this is what
there's a reason why there's so many bad teachers out there.
Well, it's true. Like, I mean, at the end of the day, there is something of a. That's why, like, someone like, I'm sorry, I know, kind of slightly fanboying again, but that's why someone like Brandon Sanderson, who actually teach a course, that is so cool to be able to actually go and learn from someone like that actually has all this experience, and he even said himself when he was restructuring and doing that course, he felt like when he was learning it, a large part of what wasn't being taught, I believe he was saying, was like the business side of things, and he wanted to get into that, and that's something he could not speak at length about that in any way as a lecturer and be taken seriously if he didn't have some skin in the game. You get what I mean? So I just think that that's something to bear in mind. Now, I would say to anyone who's listening to this, if you're thinking, well, I was going to do a YouTube video today, now, thanks to Rightcast, I'm not doing it. I'm not saying don't do it. I think, though, you should definitely, though, kind of ask yourself the question of why. Like, what is it that inspires you or makes you feel as though like you're offering something that, in a sense, you feel like, yeah, I should be saying this? Because I think that a lot of the people who are doing well with that, they obviously have a certain degree of confidence in their ability to convey that information regardless. So I'm going to just be honest with you, and this is going to maybe sound contradictory for this whole almost 40-minute episode, but I am a pragmatist. At the end of the day, it works. So despite what I've said, despite what Anthony said, despite what any of us said, it works. So if you can package it, and if you can do it, or if you want to do it, my pragmatic advice, it may not be what I personally feel in my heart of hearts, but the pragmatist in me is going to tell you, go and look at the people doing that, study the heck out of their presentation, how they're doing it, and find a way to put your own spin on that and do it. Even if you've never written a word in your life. That's my pragmatic advice. I would prefer you didn't do it, but you know what? I don't get to decide what people do. So I might as well offer you something useful if you do want to go down that path. But I would say, if you're a bit more like how I was, and you're like, I do want to talk about stuff, but I don't feel comfortable doing it like that, then just speak from your own experience. Speak about your writing journey, what you're learning, the things that you find appeal to you. You could do videos on things like why you like specific tropes, or what you find interesting about, you know, certain narrative conventions. You don't have to always make writing content in the sense of this is what you must do, because if you don't, your story will not work and editors will reject you. Even though I've never submitted anything to an editor in my life, but I'm telling you they'll reject this for sure, you know. So anyway, yes, it definitely bothers me more than you, Anthony. But it is what it is. It is what it is. I'm very passionate about it. You know, which is funny. I didn't know if I'd be able to talk about it for this long. But hey, you know, surprise us every week. But yeah, that's pretty much all I've got to say on it. You have any other final comments, Anthony, or no?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well, and hopefully we encourage someone to try to give writing a try, and if not, to maybe at least put a little bit more thought before they give it their own writing advice.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you are a storyteller out there, again, don't feel discouraged. And if you do want to just be someone who makes content without having any actual work or experience to back it up, that's fine. Just go and look at those people who've already done it and just be like, okay, well, maybe I can pull this off if I do it like this. You know, that's just the pragmatic advice. But yeah, thanks for listening, for watching. Definitely be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments if you have any on this particular episode, because again, topics like this are not things everyone discusses. So this is your opportunity. If you've ever felt like saying something about this, to say it. Or if you've never thought about it, you may completely disagree with us and be like, look, I don't think it really matters who says whatever, and here's why. Or if you watch people like this and you're like, hey, I don't really care because XYZ, then just let us know. You know, we're not going to delete your comments. Or will we? No, we won't. We ain't going to delete your comments. Just don't say anything crazy. But yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening, guys. This has been the 10th episode of The Right Cast, and we are out. Peace.
Ciao.